candidates are running for Massachusetts Attorney General in the November 2022 election. But first, there will be a primary election on September 6th, and there are currently 3 Democrats and 1 Republican in this race for Attorney General. Joining me now is Democratic candidate for Attorney General Quentin Palfrey. Thank you so much for being here today, Quentin. It's always a pleasure to have you and to talk about the important issues and, the race itself. So thank you for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me, Audrey. It's a real pleasure to be here with you.
I want to get into the nitty-gritty. I want to help the voters understand, the differences between the candidates so that they go to the polls as informed, educated voters. And so really I wanted to start off first by asking you, out of the choices that people have for Attorney General, how would you say you're different? What is it that sets you apart from the other candidates and makes you different and the right, what you would say is the right choice for the voters?
Thanks so much for that question, Audrey. So as a former Assistant Attorney General, I've seen firsthand how much impact the people's lawyer can have on everyone's lives. So I was the first chief of the healthcare division at the time that we were implementing Massachusetts health reform. We worked really hard to make sure that everyone had access to high quality, affordable health care. And I sued some big insurance companies who were lying to Massachusetts residents during that critical time. And through that experience, I got some firsthand experience about how use the Attorney General's office as a real tool for standing up for people. I've had some other relevant experiences as well. I was the senior advisor for jobs and competitiveness in the White House under President Barack Obama. And on day 1 of the Biden-Harris administration, they asked me to come back, be the acting general counsel of commerce. I led a team of several hundred lawyers and helped to launch the Build Back Better agenda. And I think that combination of experiences has given me the tools that I will need to hit the ground running as the Attorney General. If you think about the Attorneys General that we've had in the past, they've typically had a lot of experience managing other government lawyers. And I think there's a real reason for that. Over the last couple of decades, we've seen Attorney General offices be more and more impactful, but it's a complicated office. You oversee a large number of lawyers, you interact with a lot of different parts of the government, and you need to know how to use the office as a tool for fighting for people.
Well, when you say fighting for people, and you mentioned this experience that you've had and having served as an assistant AG, how do you think that that will impact the voters directly if you are elected into this office?
Yeah, I think that, when Trump was in office, everyone cheered on when the Attorney General's office fought back again and again and again against a corrupt and immoral administration. But I think now more than ever, we need the Attorney General to take on the really big challenges we face in people's lives. So I mentioned healthcare. The Attorney General can play a really big role in healthcare. I was the first chief of the healthcare division. I think the pandemic has shown how it's laid bare some of the access challenges we have in our healthcare system. Too many people struggle to afford insurance and drugs. And we need an Attorney General who will stand up for those issues. I personally believe that we need to move towards a single payer system because I think healthcare is a right that everyone should enjoy. But we need the AG to stand up for ordinary consumers. We need the AG to stand up for an economy that works for everyone. So I mentioned I was senior advisor for jobs and competitiveness in the White House. I worked in the Commerce Department for Biden. And I think that the AG needs to stand up for an economy that works for everyone. We need more powers to enforce our laws against wage theft because a lot of times when workers they work a full day, but they don't get, they get misclassified. Sometimes companies take away the benefits that they've earned. We need the power to enforce the law against this. We see Uber and Lyft trying to misclassify workers and take away their benefits. We need an AG who's going to stand up and fight back for workers. We need to stand up for the Fair Share Amendment to ask the folks at the highest end of the income spectrum to pay a little bit more so we can invest in education and transportation.
So let's take a closer look at healthcare for a minute. Since you're saying you were the first chief, let's talk about, you mentioned single payer. And now you look back, and you can look back and see what you accomplished back then, how it has played out over all these years. And what would you want to go in there and fix or correct, course correct, so to speak, now that you've seen it in play for this time and you would be in that role?
Yeah, thank you, Audrey. So when I was the first chief of the healthcare division, one of the things I asked for us to do when we were restructuring the office was to make sure that the hotline, all of the calls that come into the Attorney General's office with people expressing concerns about the healthcare system, I asked them to come directly to our healthcare division. And that allowed us to hear directly from consumers what their concerns are. And one thing that came up over and over and over again was people complaining that the insurance company salespeople had told them one thing, and then when they ended up billing their insurance company, the conditions they had, whether that was cancer or something else, weren't covered. And this happened enough times in a row that we realized that this was a real problem. So we launched an investigation into 3 big health insurance companies that were taking advantage of Massachusetts residents. We asked them to stop their behavior and pay people back, and they refused. And so we brought a lawsuit. And after a couple of years of litigation, we finally reached a resolution that got a huge amount of money back for those consumers and knocked those 3 insurance companies out of the jurisdiction. I use that as an example of one of the things that the AG can do, which is stand up for consumers using unfair and deceptive trade practices laws. We've seen recently the AG office use that same approach against Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family. Their lies were a big part of what brought us this opioid crisis that's been so devastating in Metro West and all across the Commonwealth. The AG banded together with a bunch of other attorneys general that took the lead in taking on those pharmaceutical companies who were taking advantage of Massachusetts residents. And I think that's a really important set of tools that the AG has. Those multi-state cases can be really impactful. When I was an assistant attorney general, I led one of those cases against insurance companies that were bid rigging and price fixing, along with another attorney general's office and a big group of attorneys general. We got $175 million in a recovery from that big insurance company. So I know how to use these multi-state investigations, and I know how to use these unfair and deceptive trade practices laws to stand up for consumers and get them the recoveries they deserve.
So it's all about protecting the consumers. It's about from corporations, from lenders, scammers. You know, it's really, you're the watchdog for the consumers and keeping a check on things in that role. And so there's a lot. You talked about the calls coming in, like to the hotline. The AG's office must get thousands of calls. How will your office handle those calls, and how quickly will people hear back, and what can they expect to get in terms of a response from the AG's office if you're the Attorney General?
Yeah, I loved working in the Attorney General's office because every day I felt like when I went to work, I could actually help real people with real problems. And yet, you know, so we get these individual complaints. We can talk to them on the phone. We can mediate disputes. When it's a bigger kind of a problem, we can bring an investigation or a lawsuit. And the impact of the AG's office ranges from that hands-on consumer protection and constituent services work to some of the really big cases, like the one I mentioned against Purdue Pharma, or lawsuits against Exxon Mobil, lawsuits against big banks. So you can be really concrete and you can be really impactful. I think it's really important that the AG office have constituent services all across the state. Too often, you know, state offices kind of think about Boston, and then the rest of the state is a little bit of an afterthought. We need to make sure that the AG office has a real presence everywhere across the state in all communities, in particular, targeting communities of color and communities where English is not spoken as a first language, to make sure that we are really serving the most vulnerable populations in the state. And we need to make sure that the office represents the diversity of the state as a whole, so that we can bring the power of the people's lawyer to solve the problems that most affect Massachusetts residents.
Now, in mentioning that, I have, you know, you've mentioned in your platform that you're planning to dismantle the structural racism that builds, you know, and that holds so many people back. So with that as one of your goals, how would you attack that? How would you approach that?
Yeah, I think the murder of George Floyd and the Kyle Rittenhouse verdict are just the most recent reminders that there are two justice systems in America. And so we need an AG who's going to take on systematic racial discrimination in all aspects of our work. So absolutely that involves sort of rethinking the war on drugs that has failed, doing more with criminal justice reform, with police oversight, with corrections reform. But racial injustice is not just in the criminal legal system, it's all across aspects of our lives. We're almost 70 years after Brown versus Board of Education. We still have radically segregated schools and unequal schools. We need to disrupt that. As I said, I ran in the healthcare division. We see within the healthcare system huge disparities in terms of access to care, in terms of outcomes within the system. You see that in our economy. You see that in our voting system. The climate crisis, which is another one of my major priorities, also has the civil rights aspect, because we know that communities of color are the ones that are going to be hit hardest or are hit hardest by environmental pollution and by the effects of the climate crisis. So when you think about racial justice, you need to think about it touching every aspect of the work of the Attorney General's office, because it touches every aspect of our society. And so when I think about how to take that on as Attorney General, I think about something that Biden and Harris did on day one. So I mentioned that on day one of the Biden-Harris administration, I was the acting General Counsel of Commerce. They put out an executive order where they said, basically, no matter what you do, with respect to racial injustice, we need you to make it a priority. And that may be different if you're the Secretary of Agriculture versus the Small Business Administration or the EPA, but everybody needs to take that seriously. So on day one of my administration as Attorney General, I'm going to issue a memorandum on racial justice and a parallel one on the climate crisis. And I'm going to ask everyone across the office to make those affirmative priorities for the administration. That's going to look different whether you're the Labor Bureau chief or the Civil Rights chief or the healthcare chief, or you're dealing with antitrust or you're counseling government agencies. But everyone, everywhere across the office needs to take racial justice seriously, needs to take the climate crisis seriously.
So that's a commitment starting day one. Okay.
Absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about what's happening in the wake of COVID. We're seeing price gouging. We're seeing corporations maximizing profits, blaming it on inflation and the increase in cost, but at the same time, we're seeing their profits soaring and people struggling to make ends meet. What role does the Attorney General's office play in that?
Yeah, I think that this is one of the places where the Attorney General's office really shined. We talked about the AG being the people's lawyer, and one of the main tools that we have in that respect is 93A, our unfair and deceptive trade practices laws, which helps us to do consumer protection work. We've done that during the predatory lending that we saw in the mortgage foreclosure crisis. We've done that with respect to insurance companies and payday lenders. We've seen that with respect to car dealers. The AG can really take the tools that we have and stand up for consumers against businesses when they're being exploited, and also work with businesses when their competitors are doing things that are unfair within the marketplace. We also have some tools in the antitrust division that allow us to fight back against bid rigging or price fixing or consolidation in some of these marketplaces. And we have some powers to oversee charities. So a lot of the biggest businesses in Massachusetts are actually structured as nonprofit corporations. That's true of some of the big insurance companies, some of the big hospital chains, and that gives us an additional layer of authority to make sure that nonprofits are actually working in the public interest. So the AG can really step up in a wide range of circumstances to make sure that people are protected from mistreatment by big corporations.
Thank you. I've heard you say that you would be pushing back on the assault on reproductive rights. What does pushing back mean?
Well, absolutely. Unfortunately, we see reproductive rights under attack all across the country. Roe versus Wade is hanging on by a thread in the U.S. Supreme Court. We're seeing states all over the country pass really restrictive reproductive rights laws. This is a real assault on decades of protections that we've seen in our constitutional structure. Unfortunately, I think what that means in the near term is that a lot of the decisions are going to be made at the state level, and we need state leaders like the Attorney General, like the governor, like the legislature to step up and make sure that at least here in Massachusetts, we have a robust set of protections for reproductive rights. So I would be committed to working with the legislature and the governor to expand our reproductive rights, and also to use the powers of the Attorney General's office to make sure that those protections are preserved.
And what's your stand on increasing the footprint or the amount of prisons in Massachusetts, incarceration? Where do you feel the money should be going, and what the state should be doing in terms of that?
So I think that the war on drugs has been fundamentally a failure. And over the last couple of decades, all across the country, but certainly here in Massachusetts, we have incarcerated a huge percentage of our population, way out of proportion with what other countries do. And it's not working. We're not going to arrest and incarcerate our way out of a set of challenges that are primarily about substance use disorder or mental health or unstable housing. We need to get at those underlying causes and problems. We need to rethink criminal justice in a pretty fundamental way. I very much identify myself with the progressive prosecutor movement. Rachel Rollins, for example, who's now the U.S. Attorney, when she was the district attorney of Suffolk County, experimented with innovative approaches to reducing or not using the prosecutorial discretion in certain cases to be able to try and decrease the racial discriminatory barriers in the criminal justice system, and then using evidence to evaluate in real time what's working in terms of public safety and in terms of reducing the racial disparities in the criminal legal system. I think that's exactly the right way to think about this. We ought to be shifting our resources and our focus towards actually trying to solve some of the underlying problems. And we got to disrupt some of the pathways that people get in when they get involved in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, they're long pathways, aren't they? And they start in many places where you wouldn't even suspect, but we've seen some inherent racism in some of those pathways. And how do you really decide how to get started attacking those? I mean, it's everywhere.
So, I mean, I think that there are a lot of opportunities within the prosecutorial discretion that prosecutors have to start to not prosecute, to decline to prosecute certain offenses. There are more opportunities, candidly, within DA's offices than within the Attorney General's office to decline to prosecute, because the AG is not the frontline prosecutor for a large chunk of the drug crimes or some of the other crimes that lead to large amounts of incarceration. But I think that the AG can both practice what the office preaches in those respects, and also really be a leading voice for criminal justice reform. We need to work with the legislature. There was a major piece of legislation in 2018 that passed around criminal justice reform. I think we've got a lot more to do. We need to get rid of all mandatory minimums. We need to stop criminalizing poverty. We need to think a lot more about pretrial detention. We need to do a much better job within the correction system itself And I think I've called for the AG office to put in place a special unit to be able to respond to concerns about mistreatment within the criminal justice system itself. We need to disrupt these pathways. There's some good evidence about things that work in helping young people who are at risk of criminal justice involvement. Summer jobs programs, diversion programs. There's something called cognitive behavioral therapy that has had some good efficacy in the studies that I've seen. And so we need to work really hard to try to reframe the problem and focus our energies on investing in substance use treatment, investing in mental health services, and invest in trying to take on some of the structural barriers that we're facing in these communities, as opposed to using the criminal legal system to try and resolve problems that aren't primarily law enforcement problems.
Okay. Let's talk for a minute about government transparency and the open meeting law. Would it be the AG's office that would be responsible for enforcing open meeting law? And if so, what's the balance between transparency and harassment? You know, what do you feel the AG's office, what would be the balance as you would define it?
So first of all, our democracy is under attack, quite literally, as the January 6th insurrection showed. And yet, we see a failure at the national level to take on those problems. And we have a failure right here in Beacon Hill. We have a very untransparent government on Beacon Hill. You can't get access to the governor's records. You can't get access to the legislature's records. You can't know how your legislator voted on certain measures. And so we have a very untransparent culture on Beacon Hill. We've also had a fair amount of criminal problems of the leadership of our House of Representatives in particular over the last couple of decades. We've got a lot of work to do to make our government more transparent, and that has real ramifications in terms of the legislation that you see coming out of that system. At the local level, as you mentioned, we need to do a better job of making sure that ordinary citizens have access to the deliberations that are made by municipal governments. I think that the pandemic, which has been devastating, has taught us a few things about the power of technology to open up our government. It's been really interesting to see how much more transparent government can be when you put in place a Zoom link and put things on YouTube and make it possible for people who may be working at the time or have caregiving obligations at the time to access those government activities. And so we should expand on that. Okay.
And lastly, I want to talk to you just briefly about voter rights, voter suppression, easy access to voting. Anything you want to do as AG to make it easier and more accessible for people to vote?
Yeah, thanks for this question. I've been working on this issue for 20 years. I founded the Voter Protection Corps, which is a national nonprofit organization, and I'd love to see more voting rights passed at the state level. In particular, I'd love to see election day registration. We have bureaucratic obstacles that prevent otherwise eligible voters from registering and voting. This has a disproportionate impact on people of color, on young people, and people who move around a lot. 20 states and the District of Columbia have put this in place and have been able to do it very effectively. If New Hampshire can administer election day registration, so can we. And so I strongly believe that we ought to move forward with that reform. I'd like to see the Votes Act passed, which would make permanent vote by mail and early voting for a lot of elections. But I think that there's a lot more we can do to make our voting system fairer, particularly for young people, people of color, and people who move around a lot.
And is there a site that you'd like to refer people to, or where should they go for more information to learn about you, about your candidacy and what you hope to accomplish and why you're running for AG?
Thank you so much. Please join us at www.quentinpalfrey.com. We're running a truly grassroots campaign, and we'd love to involve you in the campaign. So please come to quentinpalfrey.com and join our grassroots campaign. Thanks so much for having me, Audrey.
Thank you so much. Joining me now is Andrea Campbell, also running for Massachusetts Attorney General. Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you for having me.
Andrea, the voters have a choice, as we know. We're glad to have you here so you can talk to them. And it would be helpful to tell them why, in this choice that they have, how it would impact them differently if they elected you as Attorney General as opposed to the others who are running.
There are major distinctions between me and the other candidates. One is definitely my legal background, which I think is actually more comprehensive. I started my career representing children for free in education cases and holding school systems accountable, traditional public schools, charter schools, to deliver an excellent education for them. I worked in state government with Governor Deval Patrick as an attorney, so quite unique background legislatively. I'm the only candidate in the race who's ever passed legislation at the State House as an attorney for Governor Patrick and as a local elected official, which is critically important for the AG. And then my lived experience, quite painful and traumatic, including losing my twin brother 10 years ago. He died while in the custody of the Department of Correction. So this work is indeed personal for me, and I think connects to many struggles that families are facing. And so I would operate with a sense of urgency, compassion, empathy, and really looking out for families and those who feel left out and left behind. So combine all that, I think my candidacy is quite unique. And of course, I'm getting out there to earn the support of residents all across the state.
So with all of that and all of that ambition and lived experience, what is your top priority on your list to start working on immediately when you are and if you are elected?
I think what we're seeing on the campaign trail is coming up quite a bit is this idea that families are struggling, regardless of demographic, socioeconomic status, mental health concerns on the rise, uptick in depression, anxiety, and not just with adults, but also in youth, drug abuse, substance use disorder, these coping mechanisms. So that is rising to the top on how do we address mental health concerns and the health and well-being of our residents, including our children. The other piece that I really want to push the office to do is to be more intersectional in helping a family. A family, of course, is struggling maybe with mental health concerns, but they're also worried about wage theft. A parent went to work, didn't get paid. They're worried about climate and the environment in which they're raising their children or where they live. They're worried about predatory practices, especially among seniors, or public corruption, or racial disparities. And the AG's office is uniquely positioned to really have a more intersectional approach to helping a family while ensuring their well-being, of course. And this is for everyone across the state.
And what does that look like in terms of initiatives?
A whole host of things. Let me tell you, I've been stressing that the AG's office has a unique talent and resources and the authority to really make sure that it's doing more than just being a chief law enforcement officer. Yes, absolutely enforce all of our laws equitably and fairly, but it has all the tools and resources to address public corruption, all the tools and resources to ensure our families have access to health care, including behavioral health supports, all the tools, of course, to ensure our families have access to a living wage, to benefits, the tools to stay in their home, to grow their wealth, to address predatory practices, to ensure our children have access to an excellent education, and of course, to make sure the neighborhoods in which we are living in and raising our children, and I have two beautiful boys, that they're more resilient and more prepared for the next climate event. So that intersectional approach is key.
And which of those tools can you tap into immediately, which you feel may not have been tapped in the past?
I think there are a lot of resources available to the office that folks don't necessarily know about. So our current AG has been taking on bad actors in the context of the pharmaceutical company. There are resources available to that office to really help communities address the opioid crisis and drug abuse. And what we're seeing, and just in conversations I've been having in Western Mass, I was recently in Northampton and Greenfield and other places across the state, is there are major inequities in terms of where you can go to get treatment, to address prevention and other things related to the opioid crisis and drug abuse. We have resources to change that in the AG's office. Housing is coming up quite a bit, the lack of affordability, fear around a potential foreclosure crisis, resources in the AG's office to address that, and of course to ensure that everyone has access to mental health supports as well. So there's a lot of resources that folks don't know about. I want them to know about these resources. And then, of course, to make sure every community has equal and equitable access to those resources to solve their issues.
Sure, sure. And what have you been able to do specifically that demonstrates how you, Andrea Campbell, how you deliver results and make a difference for everyday people?
I am about getting things done. And part of that is probably my tragic life story. All of my biological parents are deceased. My mom died in a car accident when I was 8 months old, going to visit my father, who was incarcerated. My father was incarcerated for the first 8 years of my life. Then he would suddenly pass away when I was a sophomore in college. All of my biological grandparents are deceased, and my twin brother died 10 years ago. So this tragedy really informs my work. It's always been about turning pain into purpose and helping that average resident have access to opportunity and all the things they would need to be able to succeed, to thrive, and of course to prosper, the same way I have. And government has a critical role to play in ensuring that happens, especially the AG's office. And so that sense of urgency has always been there, including as a local elected official in the past, and that won't change going forward.
And will it matter to you in the AG role who is elected to be the next governor of Massachusetts?
I'm excited it will be a woman. And I think that, of course, is a major deal. It's historic. And so I am already on the campaign trail, of course, hearing from folks how excited they are with the slate of candidates that are running for a whole host of statewide offices and the historic nature of it. It's about time that we elected a woman. And so I'm excited for the possibilities of working in partnership with any state elected, of course. But we have to get there first. So we're, of course, getting out there to earn the support of residents each and every day.
Andrea, as you know, many companies right now are increasing their prices to maximize profits in the wake of COVID, kind of taking advantage of supply chain headlines, maybe some realities. But do you foresee going after any issues of price gouging? And maybe, if so, maybe you could give a few examples. You know, I'm thinking about specifically anything to do with utility companies, landlords, food and gas. The list goes on, as you know.
There's a long list, and if folks are following the recent news, of course, related to baby formula, there's a lot of work to do, and this is a major issue of price gouging. I was on a call recently with some residents talking about it in the context of prescription drugs, and specifically insulin. The ingredients of insulin have not changed dramatically, and yet the price, in some instances, is 4 times or 5 times higher than it was in the past, and particularly in the midst of COVID. That to me is an example of predatory practice and scamming going on. And the AG has a unique role and responsibility to show up on these types of cases, incredible power to protect our residents against these predatory practices, and then to think about how you go after corporate bad actors that continue, of course, to participate in this type of behavior, which is causing major economic concerns, but in the context, of course, of families and babies, real concerns about the health and well-being of our residents. So a lot to do here, and of course would exercise bold leadership.
And what issues are you most passionate about that have a direct impact on school-age children?
A whole host of issues in that context. I mentioned the mental health and well-being of our youth. I started my career representing children. My youngest client was 6 years old. My oldest was 22. Lots of clients across the state, and well-being has always been an issue. And do our schools have the adequate human capital, guidance counselors, mental health and behavioral specialists to deal with this? They do not. And I think there's a role the AG's office can play in ensuring all of our children have access to the mental health supports they need, especially in COVID. Social media, bullying, harassment coming up quite a bit, especially hate crimes within our schools. The Civil Rights Division in the AG's office, critical role to play on these issues. We're seeing some cases, but a lot more to do. And then just access to basic education. I went to 5 Boston public schools and wouldn't have made it to a Princeton University or UCLA Law School without that solid, excellent education. And I know many families and children do not have access to a high quality education. The AG's office has a critical role to play on that and on those issues as well.
When you brought up social media, I immediately thought about some of the issues that have to do with bullying and trolling, I think it's called, and just anonymity on social media as well. Anything that can be done or that you hope to attack in that area?
There's a whole division unit that the current AG created that is designed to look at disinformation, of course, through our social media platforms. This same, of course, unit division could be working with other divisions, including the Civil Rights Division, on issues related to harassment and bullying. And there's a lot that needs to be done in this space, especially around accountability with social media companies. And I think more folks want to see more aggressive action taken to address these issues. And we know it's happening. The reports and the numbers of cases that folks in the AG's office get, they're real. And so there's a lot more that office can do to address all of these issues, especially disinformation, which we know is on the rise in certain contexts as well.
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about seniors. I asked about children and school-age children, but what are you most passionate about in the Attorney General's work that would have a direct impact on senior citizens?
There's a lot we need to do to protect our elders. Predatory scams and practices, as we're having conversations around the state, it's coming up, but especially in the context of our elders and our seniors. And this has to do with financial institutions taking advantage of them, people losing their homes. So there's a lot more I think the AG's office can do, not just, of course, having hotlines where folks can call and helping them address them case by case, but I do think we need to be more proactive. Many of our elders and seniors are going to be thinking about estate planning. And yes, you can't be their direct lawyer, but you could provide a lot more information to protect them as they are planning the retirement, as they are planning their future, to make sure they're being protected. We can also make the office more accessible, especially in communities in Western Mass and other places that want to have, whether it's a satellite office or a greater presence of the AG's office in different types of clinics to give information to respond to these cases. So that community engagement, I think, needs to be more expansive. And then, of course, seniors are worried about every other issue, too. They're worried about our young people. They're worried about guns in the community. They're worried about public safety, transportation, climate. Pull them into these conversations, center them, and I'll end with hire them. Many are retired, but come with incredible skill sets and expertise. I had a senior advisor in my office when I was on the city council. This same woman is my field director in this campaign. It's an intergenerational campaign. And so hire elders who I think bring a unique perspective to the work as well is really important to me.
What about attempts to try and dismantle some of the structural racism that holds so many back? Any plans and hopes to do that?
We have a lot of work to do. And if folks are following, of course, the news in Buffalo, it is tragic. And it's a reminder that racism absolutely still exists in this country. And that when folks say Black Lives Matter, that's what they're talking about. It's folks who deem the value of someone because of their color of their skin, their humanity, to be lesser. And so there is a lot more to do in this country, and of course in the state, to protect our residents against discrimination. I think the Civil Rights Division in the AG's office is going to have to take a more prominent role going forward. There's a lot more to do in terms of legislation in the context of hate crimes. There's an uptick in anti-Semitic behavior, bullying of youth, all kinds of folks within the LGBTQ plus community experiencing discrimination, as well as Black and Brown residents. So a lot more to do to I think, strengthen our hate crime legislation in the state. And then, of course, to do the work of making our communities anti-racist communities. And there are folks in our state doing remarkable work to build in equity, to make sure that as we are putting forth policies that we're using a racial equity lens, which is, of course, the work I've done in the past and would continue as AG, blessed to become the next AG.
There's a lot of education needed in that area.
That's right.
And it's hard to educate when people are so fired up.
I agree. I do know that sharing of our stories is critically important. I share about the lot of pain and tragedy and loss I've had in my life. And I know that lived experience is resonating with residents of all different backgrounds, because all of us have experienced pain and suffering and trauma in different ways. And I think when we pull back and take away our egos and really try to create space for these conversations, it's powerful to be able to start to bring people together. I think government has a critical role to create space for these type of conversations. I know local municipalities are doing it across the state. I think local electeds and leaders want more support from an AG or from a statewide elected in these conversations. And then we have to turn it into action. And so there are conversations about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that have been happening in this state, other ways and other tangible action steps that we can take as a larger community in collaboration to ensure everyone has their civil rights protected, acknowledged, and to make sure that we are truly responding with action to the disparities that still exist in this state. And there's a lot more to do, but I'm excited about the possibilities of what an AG can do in this context while bringing people together.
Let's talk a little bit about voter suppression and what the AG can do in that role, maybe working with the Secretary of State and others throughout the Commonwealth to help make it easier for people to vote.
A lot. And I think sometimes we focus, of course, what's happening nationally. And there's, of course, ways in which the AG's office will continue to have to show up with other states, other AGs to protect the right to vote, what we're seeing in some of our southern states. But I was actually on a Zoom earlier in the campaign with folks in Springfield who were talking about voter suppression, who were talking about examples where they thought votes were being suppressed in different ways. And they were working with the AG's office and the elections division to address these concerns. So there's a lot more to do there. I think if you do it in partnership with the Secretary of State, we should be moving towards same-day registration, right? Making it easier for folks to be able to vote, early voting, mail-in voting, of course. Also civic education, civic engagement, investing in that. I had civics when I was in school. Not every school has that, which is unfortunate. Our young people really understanding the value of not just voting, but being civically engaged, and that we need the voices of our residents in order to do the work. I often say we can't solve the issues if our residents are not at the table. And so we know we have a lot more to do to increase those numbers, to get more folks to participate, to co-create policy together so that when we are putting forth ideas and solutions, we truly are putting forth policy that's thoughtful, but effective in actually helping residents with what they're grappling with.
Absolutely. Now, when you talk about same-day registration, for example, right away many people think of fraud. They think of hordes of people showing up to vote without being required to present identification, not knowing whether they're really qualified to vote or allowed to vote legally. You know, how do you work that in to provide a level of security or ensure that the community that's not what that's all about?
That's right. And one, we have to thank our local elected officials and folks who volunteer their time to ensure that our votes, of course, are counted, but the whole process is legitimate and legal. There are people all across this state, all 351 municipalities, doing remarkable work every day to ensure that. And so one, I want to extend gratitude to them because they often don't get it. But this has been a conversation for some time. And I want someone to point out actual reports where that's been the case. It hasn't. Fraud hasn't come up. And so if we are serious about increasing the number of folks participating in voting, we should make it easier for them to do that. Our residents are working hard. Some folks 2 or 3 jobs. They want to participate, but they have a lot going on. If you have children, there's a lot going on in the world right now. Mm-hmm. So if we want to, of course, make it easier for folks to participate, there are concrete ideas out there that other states and other municipalities across the country are adopting, and they're working to increase the numbers while also, of course, addressing any issues of fraud, which are not coming up.
And what about extending voting for more than one day?
I think that's important. Some folks, of course, have talked about it being on the weekend, just making it easier and more accessible. And I think we always have to be reevaluating when something is not working, especially if we say we're serious about getting more folks to participate and engage. Mm-hmm. And I don't know any government institution that can really be great at its job and effective if the number of residents participating remains low. And so we know there's a lot more work to do to increase those numbers. And we also know that folks will show up if you make it more accessible and easier for them to participate.
Thank you. What about, the attack on reproductive rights all across the country right now, and the fact that there's even talk at the federal level of trying to push some kind of law that would prevent states from bypassing a new ruling by the Supreme Court. What are your thoughts about protecting women's or all reproductive rights in Massachusetts?
We're going to have to take the lead and continue to take the lead. I often say we live in the best state in the nation, and we do, because we have protections here that value, of course, the humanity of folks and ensure access to basic healthcare, which reproductive healthcare is, we have been taking the lead for some time. So one, I think the AG's office is going to have to educate folks that given the composition of the Supreme Court right now, reproductive healthcare, civil rights, environmental rights, basic rights are going to be jeopardized. And reproductive healthcare is just one set of rights. But here in Massachusetts, that your right is protected, right? We have actually codified Roe here in Massachusetts. We've also codified reproductive health care as being a part of your essential health care plans here in Massachusetts. We've done that. The next step is, of course, ensuring that providers are protected and not criminally liable. And so I think New York and Connecticut are doing some of that work. We're going to have to do the same and ensure that we increase the number of providers doing the work, because this is going to become a place where more people come to ensure they have access to basic healthcare and critical services.
Now, obviously, you mentioned that this is all also a part of our healthcare system overall, which you also mentioned when you were talking about seniors and the cost of prescription drugs, et cetera.
Right.
Given the opportunity in the AG's role, what would you do really to take on some of the major issues with the overall healthcare system? What would be your priorities? What would you want to be able to take on in that role?
We're blessed to live in a state where we have near universal coverage. It's a small percentage, about 2% of folks that are not covered. And there's been different studies done that suggest some of those folks may not want to be covered, but we can always work to close that gap. The biggest issues are the costs. In certain communities, it is on the uptick, or what you're paying for your healthcare services. Prescription drugs, of course, the rise in the cost of these things. So the AG is going to have to really look at the drivers of these costs and work with folks to reduce those. Also to make sure that every community has accessible gender affirming care. I was just out in Berkshire County, and we talk about healthcare. That also includes mental health beds, or if you're dealing with drug abuse or substance use disorder, that you have a place to go for treatment and services. In some places, including Berkshire County, if we have a young person, for example, in crisis, there are no beds within that community. That is absolutely absurd. And so the accessibility piece, critically important, and of course ensuring that the costs are going down for residents and that we're providing gender affirming care in every community, critically important. The AG's office has a critical role to play, especially that bureau.
Thank you. In terms
and I'll just add, I should have mentioned this, also disparities, whether racial disparities or disparities that we're seeing in rural communities, low income communities, are stark and of course exacerbated by COVID.
Right.
More work is necessary in those areas. And I know there are different coalitions that are forming and doing great work where they want the AG's office to show up in an even greater way. And I think there's an appetite for that to happen. So I think that's another place for the AG to show up.
Right, and we're not going to be able to make any improvements there if we don't take care of the workers as well. They've really gone through a lot during this pandemic. My last question has to do with transparency and the open meeting law and government transparency. What are some of the issues that you want to take on or that you see existing, and how do we create more balance between transparency versus harassment? You know, there are cases where there's a lack of transparency, and then there's a case where the law for transparency is leading to harassment. You know, how do you find that balance, and how do you tackle that whole issue to make sure that government is open, but the other issues are not allowed to take over?
I think the principles or values are transparency and accountability, right? They go hand in hand. And if you are not transparent, it is then very difficult, of course, to hold folks accountable. And I do think there are laws in place, open meeting law, one example, open meeting law, public records law, where folks want to see that expanded to include more institutions and agencies. And I think that's right if we say we're serious about transparency. And I think there's a role that the AG's office plays in being at the table and a part of those conversations as well. It shouldn't be so difficult for a resident to get basic information about votes and about different agencies' compliance with certain laws, diversity requirements, et cetera. Transparency critically important. And also, of course, to solve the issue. If we want to increase diversity in government, we first have to know where we are. And I always say, put that information out there, let it live on our websites so that we can then do the hard work as a collective to ensure we are meeting diversity requirements, for example, that we are implementing our laws fairly and equitably as well. And I think the AG's office is uniquely positioned to drive that transparency and accountability conversation. And when trust is at just such a low, it's just, I don't know if it's an all-time low, but it's very low between residents and government. We really have to do everything we can to build trust, and transparency and accountability allow us to do that. And so those principles are really important. I think guiding principles, they should be guiding principles for everyone who works in the AG's office and for the office as a whole, of course.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for being here today to talk about your candidacy for Attorney General for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Appreciate you being here and sharing your important history, experience, and your positions. There's a primary election in this race scheduled for September 6th, and the general election will be on November 8th. Take a good, hard look at all the candidates and be prepared to make your vote count by being an informed voter. Hopefully this has helped. Thank you for tuning into the Audrey Hall Show, where you will always learn something new.